Have you ever felt like you're just drowning in information, trying to keep up with the global economy, politics, technology, and just getting totally overwhelmed? Well, today we're cutting through some of that noise. For this deep dive, we're stepping into the mind of a pretty unique global macro investor, Ray Dalio. He spent over 50 years navigating the world's markets. We'll be exploring insights from his latest work, How Countries Go Broke, the Big Cycle.
Yeah, and Dalio, he approaches economics not like an academic. He's someone who's actually made a career betting on how things will unfold.
Right.
Kind of describes his method like a doctor studying lots and lots of cases, really examining the mechanics, the cause and effect relationships within economic systems. His mission, as he puts it in sharing this book, is to pass along these timeless and universal principles, things he believes can help make the world run better for policymakers, for investors, really for everyone.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack Dalio's really revolutionary concept of the big debt cycle. And look at how he shows it intertwines with these massive global forces, how they shape our present and maybe hint at our future. Get ready for some genuinely surprising facts, I think, and maybe a few aha moments that could change how you see the world.
Okay, so let's dive deeper. Dalio talks about this big debt cycle, something he says, quote, nobody acknowledges or talks about. What exactly is this thing he's pointing to?
Well, what's really striking is that Dalio found that beyond the business cycle we all know and the short-term debt cycle, there's this massive long-term debt cycle. Typically lasts about 80 years, give or take, maybe 25 years. And he describes it as unfailingly leading to these huge debt bubbles and then inevitably busts. What's fascinating and maybe a bit alarming is he couldn't find any good studies on it, not in textbooks. Even when he talked to leading economists, they didn't really have much to say about it. That's kind of staggering, isn't it? An 80-year cycle that goes largely unacknowledged,
Yeah.
especially since, like you said, 80 years. That's longer than most lifetimes. So we don't learn about it from experience. If it's so fundamental, why do you think it's so overlooked?
Yeah, it seems to boil down to a few things. People tend to get really focused on what's happening right now, right around them. They miss the big picture.
Mm.
And there's also just a natural human bias, isn't there?
Yeah.
Most people enjoy the spending power that credit gives them.
Sure, the immediate gratification.
Exactly. So there's a sort of reluctance to worry too much about debt. And you see it, memories of big crises fade. Think about 2008, the global financial crisis, or the European debt crisis with the PIGS countries.
Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain. Yeah.
Right. Those memories have faded. And many people just assume, oh, policymakers figured out how to manage that,
Mm-hmm.
instead of seeing them as, warnings of potentially even bigger crises down the road.
Okay, so this fundamental dynamic of credit and debt, what does it mean for how economies really work in Dalio's view?
Well, Dalio explains that credit is basically the main way we fund spending. And crucially, it can be created almost out of thin air. So when there's a lot of credit sloshing around, people spend more, they earn more, asset prices go up.
Everyone feels richer.
Everyone loves it. And that's exactly why central governments, central banks, they have this bias towards creating lots of credit. But here's the catch. Credit also creates debt, debt that has to be paid back. And when those debts are paid back, it means less spending, lower incomes, lower asset prices, which naturally people don't like.
The flip side.
The flip side, Dalio calls this whole credit spending, debt paying back thing inherently cyclical.
Ah.
And he gives a stark warning. If you're not careful, debt and the cost of servicing that debt, the interest payments, they can grow like a cancer, just gradually eating up buying power, squeezing out other consumption.
That sounds less like a smooth cycle and more like a multi-act pay with a kind of predictable, maybe even tragic progression. Dalio breaks this big debt cycle into distinct stages. Can you walk us through how it usually unfolds, starting from, say, a place of apparent health?
Yeah, absolutely. It begins with what he calls the sound money stage.
Yeah.
Here, net debt levels are pretty low. Money is hard, meaning it's a medium exchange, sure, but also a storehold of wealth that can't just be easily increased by governments. Think gold, silver. Or more recently, he even mentions Bitcoin as a kind of modern example.
Interesting.
Yeah. The paper money circulating is convertible into this hard money at a fixed price. There isn't a ton of paper money or debt out there. He gives this fascinating snapshot from 1945, which he sees as the start of our current big debt cycle. Back then, the ratios of U.S. government debt and the U.S. money supply, specifically M0, the really basic stuff like currency divided by the amount of gold the U.S. held, those ratios were 7x and 1.3x.
Okay.
Compare that to today. The ratios are now 37x and 6x.
Wow, huge difference.
Massive. So in this early stage, The country is competitive, debt fuels actual productivity, confidence grows. Risky assets might even be relatively cheap because people are still cautious from previous bad times.
That picture of sound money and low debt, it sounds almost, I don't know, idyllic from where we stand now. But as Dalio explains, that very stability often sows the seeds for what comes next. How does that growth lead into the debt bubble stage?
Precisely. That's the transition. Next comes the debt bubble stage. Money suddenly becomes readily available, it's cheap to borrow. This drives a debt-financed economic expansion that just feels fantastic while it's happening. Demand goes up, prices for goods, services, assets, everything gets pushed higher. Sentiment gets incredibly bullish. Markets can look really overpriced.
The good times are rolling, fueled by borrowing.
Exactly. And Dalio points out, often during this time you see amazing new inventions that investors just pour money into, maybe without properly assessing the future cash flows.
Like the dot-com bubble.
Yeah. Potentially. He notes that wealth gets created out of nothing, meaning there's way more imagined wealth, what people think they have on paper, versus actual existing wealth. He gives a modern example. A unicorn company, valued over $1 billion, but maybe it's only raised $50 million in actual capital. Why? Because speculative VCs invested just to get these option-like chips, hoping for a massive payoff, even if the underlying business isn't solid yet.
Gambling on the future.
Right. He identifies this stage when you see long periods, say 3 years or more, where debt is growing significantly faster than income. Eventually, this dynamic becomes unsustainable. The debt spiral hits a point of no return, and that sets up the debt crisis.
And that, of course, leads to the inevitable correction. What happens when the system hits that point of no return? When we enter what Dalio calls the deleveraging stage.
Yeah, this is usually a very, very painful period. Debt and debt service levels have to be brought down to something sustainable. Problems often start in the private sector, then they spread to the central government, and finally they hit the central bank. You start seeing things like runs on banks. Private holders of debt try to sell their assets, bonds, whatever, to get real cash money, but the banks just don't have enough of it.
Liquidity dries up.
Exactly. This mass selling forces interest rates up, making debt even harder to service for everybody else. Eventually, when interest rates hit rock bottom, around 0%, central banks run out of their usual tools. They have to switch to new ones. Meanwhile, the government's own debt tends to explode. Tax revenues plummet because the economy is slowing down.
And spending goes up to try and help people support the private sector.
Right. Bailouts, stimulus, all that.
Mm.
Dalio uses this great phrase, pushing on a string, which actually came from policymakers back in the 1930s. It describes how hard it is for stimulative policies to actually get people spending again because savers and businesses are just too scared to borrow or invest.
Fear takes over.
Totally. So central banks face this really stark choice. Do they keep money hard, stick to principles, but risk deflationary depressions and widespread defaults? Or do they make money soft by printing a whole lot of it, which eventually leads to inflation? A typical deleveraging, he finds, reduces that overall debt-to-income ratio by roughly 50%. It's a major reset.
That sounds absolutely brutal. But Dalio talks about a beautiful deleveraging. Is that actually achievable, or is it more like an ideal scenario?
It's definitely an ideal, but he argues it is achievable if managed well. A beautiful deleveraging involves this really delicate balancing act. You need to balance debt restructurings, writing off bad debts, which is deflationary, with monetary stimulation, printing money, which is inflationary and stimulates growth.
So finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. Getting that balance just right so you can achieve positive economic growth while debt burdens are falling and keep inflation at an acceptable level. But whether it's done beautifully or poorly, this stage ultimately does reduce the debt burden. It establishes a bottom, and from that bottom, a new big debt cycle can eventually begin. It's a reset, however painful.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Dalio uses this framework to look at our modern history since World War II. He breaks it down into distinct monetary policy phases that kind of illustrate this whole cycle playing out. Can you walk us through those, starting from 1945?
Sure. He starts with MP0, 1945-1971, a linked hard monetary system. This was the Bretton Woods system. Paper money, like the US dollar, was directly linked to gold at a fixed price. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, mainly because the U.S. held something like 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves.
Right, Fort Knox and all that.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the U.S. and most other countries actually made it illegal for their own citizens to own gold back then, because governments wanted people to save using debt assets, like government bonds. They wanted to channel savings into funding government spending.
Keep the money in the system they controlled.
Pretty much. But Governments, including the U.S., especially in the 60s with the Vietnam War and the war on poverty spending, they overspent. The promises they made on paper to give gold back far exceeded the actual gold sitting in the central bank vaults. This led to runs on their central banks as countries holding dollars started wanting gold instead.
They called the U.S.'s bluff.
Essentially, yes. Dalio notes French President Charles de Gaulle was openly calling for reform back in 1965. Ultimately, the U.S. just couldn't keep the promise. In August 1971, President Nixon broke the link. No more gold convertibility.
The Nixon shock.
That's the one. And that brought us to MP1, 1971-2008. Fiat money, interest rate-driven monetary policy. With the gold link gone, money became fiat, backed only by government promise. Central banks now mainly controlled money and credit by changing interest rates, raise rates to slow things down, cut rates to speed things up.
The tool we became familiar with for decades.
Exactly. But this period kicked off with stagflation from 71 to about 82. Remember that. Stagnant growth, high inflation, awful mix. The Fed increased the money supply dramatically. M0 up 100%, M2 up 180%. Prices, the CPI went up 140%. Right. And gold, its price went up tenfold.
Wow.
So debtors did great. They could pay back their loans with dollars that were worth much less. Creditors, savers, they lost huge amounts of buying power. Dalio famously says it paid to be a borrower-debtor during that era.
Inflation ate away the real value of the debt.
Precisely. This era also saw big geopolitical events. The Arab-Israeli War, rising oil prices, which fueled debt finance bubbles in places like commodity-producing emerging economies. This whole MP1 policy era lasted until interest rates basically hit zero in the 2008 crisis.
Okay, so rates hit zero. What next?
Then came MP2, 2008-2020. Fiat money and debt monetization, or what we mostly know as quantitative easing, QE. With interest rates at the floor, central banks had to pull out a new tool. QE basically meant printing money to buy massive amounts of debt, mostly government bonds. The idea was to pump liquidity into the system, keep credit flowing to the government and the marketplace.
Topping up the system.
Yeah. This was the first time this kind of policy had been used on such a scale since way back in 1933 during the Great Depression. Dalio highlights that during this MP2 period, something else was happening. Labor's share of national income kept trending down. It hit its lowest level since the 1950s, and wealth and income gaps got significantly worse.
QE benefited asset owners more than wage earners.
That's a common interpretation, yeah. Then finally we get to where we are now, or recently started. MP3, 2020 present, coordinated fiscal and monetary policy. This really kicked off with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You had massive government spending, huge fiscal deficits.
Stimulus checks, business support.
All that. And central banks, mainly the Fed, essentially monetized this debt. They bought up huge amounts of the government bonds issued to pay for it all. This massive MP3 type of coordination, as Dalio calls it, led directly to a big surge in inflation.
Right, combined with supply chain problems and conflicts.
Exactly. It was a potent mix. So then the Fed had to pivot, slam on the brakes, tighten policy, raise interest rates sharply, both nominal and real rates. Dalio's own bubble indicator, his measure of market frothiness, had soared to 75% by the end of 2020.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. But after the tightening, it fell hard, down to 35%. This hurt asset prices, especially for companies with weak profits or no profits at all. Despite all this turbulence, Dalio notes that right now the U.S. economy actually appears to be in a sort of excellent equilibrium level. Decent growth, inflation coming down.
Okay, so maybe things aren't so bad?
Well, here's the but. He warns that government debt is still growing like a cancer. And he projects a significant risk that both a debt squeeze and an economic downturn will simultaneously happen 2 or 3 years from now. So maybe a temporary calm before another potential storm.
Right. This whole framework, this way of looking at history through monetary policy shifts, it feels underpinned by a very specific, maybe even unconventional view of how markets work. Dalio says his approach to supply, demand, price, it's different from conventional economists. How so?
Yeah, that's a really key point. Dalio explains that standard economics usually measures supply and demand just in terms of quantity. Quantity bought, quantity sold. His approach, though, focuses much more intensely on the actual transactions. A buyer gives money or credit to a seller. In exchange, they get a good, a service, or a financial asset. He defines price, P, very simply. Price, PP, total amount spent by buyers. Total quantity sold by sellers.
Okay, so price is spending divided by quantity.
Exactly. It seems simple, but it's a powerful shift in focus. It suggests we need to look less at abstract supply-demand curves and more at the actual flow of money and credit in transactions. It's about spending power, not just quantity. He believes if you know the total amount spent and the total quantity sold, Q, you know the price, and he says everything else you need to know.
Mm.
The real key for him is figuring out the motivations of the buyers and sellers, especially the big players, central banks, governments, huge investment funds.
Why are they doing what they're doing?
Right. If you can figure that out, he claims, you can pretty accurately predict their actions and the price.
Hmm.
He says he's found this unique perspective invaluable for spotting unsustainable prices and unsustainable economic conditions before they blow up.
That idea of focusing on the flow of money and motivations, it really does force you to look at the financial system differently, doesn't it? So how does this connect back to his understanding of debt and currency specifically?
It connects directly. Dalio states it very plainly. Debt is currency and currency is debt.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
What he means is, think about a debt asset like a bond. What is it really? It's just a promise to receive a specific amount of currency back in the future. So logically, if you don't like the outlook for the currency, maybe you think it's going to lose value due to inflation, then you shouldn't like the debt asset denominated in that currency, like the bond.
Because you'll be paid back in cheaper money.
Exactly, and vice versa, especially when you consider their relative yields, the interest rates. This whole assessment, do I like the currency? Do I like the debt? That's what drives capital flows between countries. For instance, if country A's government bonds pay a lower interest rate than country B's, Dalio explains that you'd normally expect country B's currency, the higher rate one, to fall in value over time to offset that interest rate difference.
Otherwise, everyone would just pile into country B for easy profit.
Right, otherwise there'd be virtually risk-free profits,
Yeah.
and the market arbitrages that away pretty quickly. So zooming out, he emphasizes a fundamental truth. Over the long run, debt simply cannot rise faster than the income needed to service it. It's mathematically impossible long-term. And interest rates can't stay too high for borrowers or too low for lenders for very long without causing major problems.
Things break.
Things break. He points out 4 key indicators he watches closely for debt risks. 1, debts relative to income. 2, debt service interest payments relative to income. 3, the interest rate itself relative to the income growth rate. And 4, the primary deficit.
The deficit before interest payment.
Correct. And he clarifies, for governments, looking at debt to revenue is often more relevant than the common debt to GDP ratio.
Because GDP is the whole economy, revenue is what the government actually takes in to pay bills.
Exactly. What really matters are the government's actual cash flows to service its debt.
Okay, now this is where Dalio really broadens the lens, pulls it all together. He argues that these debt cycles, the economic shifts, they're just one part of an overall big cycle made up of 5 huge interacting forces. What are these 5 forces that he says are driving, well, pretty much everything?
Right. This is his grand synthesis.
Yeah.
He believes we're currently about 80 years into this overall big cycle, which he traces back to the end of World War II. And he thinks it's unfolding in really classic, predictable ways that are going to produce some dramatic changes ahead. So the 5 forces are, first, the one we spent most time on, the debt, credit, money economic cycle, the financial boom and bust dynamics. Second is the internal order and disorder cycle. This is basically about conflict within countries, potentially leading towards civil strife or even civil war in extreme cases.
Politics, social cohesion.
Exactly. Dalio observes that when democracies start to fail, often due to big gaps in wealth and values, worsening economic conditions, weak or fragmented leadership, they lose the ability to compromise and fix problems. This tends to lead to intensifying populist conflicts, fights between, say, the hard right, a weak middle, and the hard left, a real struggle for power. And he makes the historical point. When democracies fail, autocracies come in. He cites examples like Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Hitler, Mussolini.
Oof. Heavy examples.
Yeah. And he observes that in the U.S. today, you see big political shifts, mostly toward the hard right. It's happening for similar reasons as in the past. He argues internal political conflicts now are among the most severe in history.
Okay, so internal conflict is number 2. What's third?
Third is the mirror image, the external order and disorder cycle. This is about conflict between nations, potentially leading to international war. He argues that periods of multilateralism, global cooperation are actually historically rare. They usually only happen after major wars and are often enforced by a dominant power.
Like the U.S. after WWII establishing the Bretton Woods system, the UN.
Exactly. But Dalio argues that multilateralism is now fading into irrelevance. Unilateralism, countries acting alone in their own perceived interest, is rising, leading to a situation where, as he puts it, the strong prey on the weak. He points directly to the intensifying great power conflict between the U.S. and its allies on one side and China and its allies on the other. China has strengthened immensely over 50 years, now approaching the U.S. in overall power.
The Thucydides trap idea, rising power challenging an established one.
Very much echoes of that. While Dalio doesn't think a direct U.S.-China military war is likely in the near future, mainly due to mutual destruction fears, nuclear weapons, though he flags Taiwan as the key sovereignty trigger for China, he absolutely asserts they are engaged in other kinds of war already. Diplomatic war, cyber war, trade war, technology war.
The new battlegrounds.
Right. And he explicitly notes that current events look quite like the 1930s period leading up to World War II.
Okay, that's sobering. Force number 4.
Fourth are acts of nature. Dalio makes a powerful point here. Throughout history, things like droughts, floods, pandemics, they've actually killed more people and toppled more societies than wars have.
We tend to focus on human conflicts, but nature is a huge force.
A massive force. And he states these events are increasing in frequency and cost, partly due to human factors: pollution, climate change, higher population density, more international travel spreading diseases faster. He believes these problems are likely to get worse, requiring huge spending just for adaptation. And this could itself lead to more domestic conflict over resources, or mass emigration, which then strains other countries. It's all connected.
And the fifth force?
Fifth, and potentially hugely disruptive, is human inventiveness, most importantly of new technologies. This obviously encompasses the rapid advances we're seeing, especially in artificial intelligence, AI. Dalio believes we are right on the brink of a new era where machine thinking will supplement or surpass human thinking. He draws an analogy to the Industrial Revolutions, where machine labor surpassed human labor. Now it might be machine thinking.
A fundamental shift.
Potentially. He highlights the U.S. and China as the main competitors, locked in a race to design and control these powerful new technologies. While the U.S. currently leads in making the most advanced semiconductor chips, Dalio notes China is close behind, and actually ahead in producing less advanced chips more cheaply, and perhaps more importantly, ahead in actually deploying AI across its economy and society.
So those are the 5 forces: debtonomics, internal conflict, external conflict, nature, and technology. How do they interact?
Crucially, Dalio stresses they are deeply interconnected. They influence each other constantly. And based on his analysis of where we are with all 5, he believes we are currently in stage 5 of the overall big cycle. This is typically a time when major countries are over-indebted, they're run inefficiently, they're deeply divided internally, and they feel increasingly threatened by other countries.
Sounds like a dangerous combination.
Historically, yes. It's at times like these that you tend to see the rise of more nationalistic, protectionist, militaristic, and often autocratic leaders. He cautions that this specific configuration of conditions has historically led to radical, previously unimaginable actions by governments. Things like freezing debt payments, seizing assets of adversary nations, imposing confiscatory taxes or capital controls, defaulting on debts altogether, or even changing the fundamental nature of money in circulation.
Wow. Really, extreme measures become possible.
Yeah. And ultimately, he concludes that the biggest and most important force is how people deal with each other, cooperation versus conflict. But unfortunately, his objective reading of the current situation leads him to believe the chances of cooperation for mutual benefit are not good.
That paints a powerful and, yeah, frankly, a bit sobering picture of where we might be in this grand historical cycle. So, given this analysis, particularly the debt situation in the U.S., what does Dalio propose? Does he offer any solutions?
He does offer a very pragmatic, specific plan for the U.S., which he calls the 3% three-part solution.
Yeah.
The goal is straightforward. Cut the annual U.S. budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. Currently, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projects it to be roughly 6%, so it's a significant cut.
Having the deficit, basically. How?
Through 3 levers, ideally used in roughly equal measure: spending cuts, tax increases, and interest rate cuts. He argues that interest rate reductions, if achievable, would actually be the most impactful part. He calculates that this balanced approach could reduce the total national debt burden by about 17%. That's equivalent to $9 trillion over 10 years. And by 31%, a massive $26 trillion over 20 years. This, he argues, would greatly reduce the risk of what he calls a financial heart attack for the U.S. government.
Okay, so spending cuts, tax hikes, rate cuts. How feasible is that mix?
He suggests spreading the pain roughly. Maybe a 4% cut in spending, a 4% increase in taxes, and managing a 1% cut in real interest rates, ideally phased in over about 3 years. And he points to history. The U.S. experience from 1993 to 1998. Back then, the deficit was cut by 5% of GDP. It went from a 4% deficit to a 1% surplus.
The Clinton years here.
Right. He uses that as proof that large fiscal tightenings are possible and they can actually go well if economic growth stays strong and monetary policy is kept relatively easy to compensate.
But cutting spending, politically, very hard, isn't it? Especially things like Social Security, Medicare.
Absolutely. He acknowledges that about 70% of non-interest government spending is considered mandatory: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But he argues that even relatively modest changes to these programs, phased in gradually, like slowly raising the Social Security retirement age from 67 perhaps towards 70, could have significant long-term impacts. The other 30% is discretionary spending: defense, veterans care, education, etc. That's often seen as untouchable too, but he suggests it also needs to be part of the solution.
A very specific blueprint, then, for trying to navigate what he sees as a pretty perilous path. Looking further ahead, how does Dalio use this whole template, these cycles and forces, to actually forecast the future? What's his final word on what he sees coming?
Well, he's always quite humble about forecasting, emphasizes the uncertainty, but he uses his understanding of these deep cause-effect relationships to spot what he calls big, unsustainable conditions. And then he essentially bets against those unsustainable conditions persisting forever. He expects reversions to the mean, corrections. He reiterates that he sees the current conditions, this was as of March 2025 in his writing, as most closely resembling two specific past periods: 1905, 1914.
Leading up to World War I.
Right. And 1933, 1938?
Leading up to World War II.
Exactly. That's why he calls this stage 5 of the big cycle. Countries are over-indebted, inefficient, divided internally, threatened externally, leading to the rise of more nationalistic, autocratic leaders. He specifically observes that a potential Trump administration, for example, would likely take a strong, practical, sort of capitalist approach, working with figures like Elon Musk, and that this would tap into a popular American exceptionalism meme or feeling.
The idea that America is different can overcome these cycles.
Right. Dalio thinks that meme does have some merit, especially regarding U.S. innovation capacity and its deep capital markets. But he also believes that optimism is likely more than reflected in the prices already. He anticipates other big problems brewing from the other forces. He estimates that even powerful technological advances, like AI, will most likely not be enough to overpower the headwinds coming from the other forces, if those other forces, internal conflict, external debt, are not managed well.
So tech alone might not save us if the other stuff goes bad.
That's his caution. Historically, he says, the productivity gains from great new technologies often get squelched when the other forces of the big cycle turn really negative. Ultimately, he circles back to his main point. The biggest, most important force is how people deal with each other. He believes that if people can cooperate, work together to solve these massive shared problems, then the best outcomes are still possible. However, his objective examination of history and current trends leads him to conclude that the chances of that kind of cooperation are, in his words, not good. Mainly due to the extreme factionalism we see, where opposing sides just seem determined to fight to win at all costs rather than find common ground.
Wow. We've covered an incredible amount of ground today, from the micromechanics of debt all the way up to these grand interconnected global forces in the big cycle. As we wrap up, what's the single biggest takeaway for you? Something that really resonated or maybe surprised you that you'd want listeners to walk away thinking about?
I think what really stands out for me from Dalio's work is just how he manages to connect things that often feel separate. Geopolitical tensions over here, a tech breakthrough over there, climate events, debt levels. He weaves them together into this single, coherent, albeit complex narrative, seeing them all as pieces of this larger, somewhat predictable cycle. It's a really powerful framework. And for him, it means the absolute most important factor for the coming years is simply how well those other forces, particularly the human conflict ones, are managed.
Right. And that cycle, in his view, while it has this deep historical rhythm, almost like a tide, it's still profoundly influenced by how we respond. It's not just pure predestination. It's also a test of human action, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not fatalistic, but it is cautionary. And that really raises, I think, an important final question for you, the listener, to mull over. If Dalio's analysis is broadly right, and if the biggest, most critical force truly is how people deal with each other, then what is the most radical individual action you can take starting today to potentially, even in a small way, alter the trajectory of these massive, seemingly unstoppable cycles?